Good evening and welcome to the second lecture for Construction Management 1. This week what we'll do is we'll have a quick look at project procurement and contract management. Specifically, we'll touch on the different types of contracts that we are going to use. There's one or two questions in assessment item number 1 that might be you might be able to answer better after tonight. Some of the answers will definitely come on there tonight. All right, so the first thing that we have to think about is, of course, who are the parties to a contract. And typically this is now where large class numbers work so much better because we would have a little bit of participation. So I'll start the process, and Adrian and Reese, if you guys want to just jump in there at any point in time, just hit the talk button and you'll be able to talk. If we look at it, basically we're going to have the client. All right, and in some instances, the client is going to be called the employer, or maybe even the buyer. So let's put a E there or a B. So those are all the different types of names that we can have for our client. He's definitely going to be one of the parties to the contract. In the most simplest form of contracts, the only other party that we're going to have might be a contractor. All right, and the contractor might be over there. All right, so in the case where we've got a really well-defined scope from our client, so the scope of work over here is really great. All right, so that's a little smiley face. It means that it's a simple relationship. There's only one party in there, the client and the contractor will be responsible to do all of the work for our client. If we say that the client isn't as well organized as he would want to be, we can say that yes, there's going to be a client. All right, so there's our client back up again. All right, and he might employ what we call a professional team. Let's just call them professional team over there. And the professional team might have a project manager in there. It might have a quantity surveyor in there, and of course there might be an engineer. All of those guys, even maybe sometimes an architect. So the professional role of the architect has diminished over the last couple of years, and it's sort of been overtaken by our project managers. There's also going to be a scope there for maybe somebody that deals with quality control. So quality, typically we call those parties supervisors in terms of the contract. All right, so these guys might be responsible for the generation of our contract documentation. All right, so they'll make sure that our client gets up to speed. All right, there's our client, and these guys will be able to give us a scope of work. All right, so there's our scope of work. All right, welcome back, Paul. I see you've joined us again. We've just started, so no worries. So we're just talking about the different parties to the contract and what each of them will do. Also, we've spoken about the professional team on this side, and of course the quantity surveyor, all of those guys that's going to be part of the professional team assisting our client. All right, so if we look at the setup at the moment, what's missing? Right, so we've got a client, we've got the professional team, we've got a scope of work, which is basically our drawings and everything. We basically need somebody to do the work for us. Right, so if we say there's contractor 1, the contractor might be responsible for, let's say, the foundations. We might have another contractor in there that's responsible for the superstructure, and that will take it from there. Yep, subcontractors, definitely. The subcontractors will sit over there, so subbies, and the subbies will typically sit from there. We'll be able to see that, maybe I should just draw that sketch a little bit better. So let's see if I can wipe that out. Let's do that. Yep. All right, so typically what we'll see is our subcontractors will be part of the team that's represented by a contractor. All right, who else might be part of the team for our contract? Are we missing somebody? Are there any third parties that we don't know about yet? In some cases, we might have an adjudicator. All right, an adjudicator might sit over there. Yep, the superintendent. Well, the superintendent, that's the guy that I basically had over there looking after quality and supervising the quality management process, making sure all of that stuff is in place. So Adrian, if that's what you had in mind with that, if you can give me a yes or a no, or alternatively just type something out there. All right, so our adjudicator, or if there might be a dispute, we might have a third party taking care of that dispute for us. All right, so these are typically the baseline parties to the contract that we'll have. Does anybody want to add anything to that, or can we move on from the parties to the contract? All right, so if you want, you can just give me a yes or a no. So that would just be a little yes tick mark over there, and that will get us on the go. All right. Okay, so there we go. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so the contract that we're going to have a look at for tonight is basically there's different types of contracts. So we might have licensing agreements. If you think about stuff like software, SAP, all right, so that would be a typical licensing agreement that we'll have in place with that, where we say we'll license the software and we allow people to use it. SAP is most probably one of the largest companies in the world in terms of ERP software, enterprise resource planning, and they typically have these licensing agreements in place. Right, other companies like Honeywell, they also specialize in licensing agreement for specific control instrumentation. That's a little bit closer to what we do. Right, then of course, performance guarantee agreements. Who wants to take a guess on an example for a performance guarantee example? Anyone? Right, while Adrian is typing, I'll maybe just put Telstra over there. So Telstra would typically be, yep, there we go, related to the output of a plant. It's basically guaranteed. So the easiest example there in everyday life would be a company like Telstra, right? Because they supply communication services to both the government and private sector, and they talk of a service level agreement or uptime of 99.5% of the time. Well, so that means that they guarantee that there's redundancy in their system and that they can maintain connection even though something goes horribly wrong. All right, when we look at the next one, the PSCs over there, professional services contracts, those types of contracts are specifically used for the soft issues when it comes to our contracting. So anything that deals with design or engineering, coming up with a specific type of solution, that would be a professional services contract. Once again, we get different types of professional services contracts, and when we get to the slide dealing with PSCs, we'll talk about that some more. And another option that we have, purchase orders. All right, so the short and sweet thing about purchase orders is it's off the shelf. All right, so whenever we need to buy anything that's just off the shelf, we don't need any kind of modification or serious installation, we're just going to use a purchase order. It's the easiest way to do. There's no need for the supplier or the vendor to make any changes, and therefore we can use that. Now the next three items there that we've got is basically, let's just see if we can, it's actually four of them. Engineer, procure and construction, and EPCC is added commissioning, and of course my favorite over there, engineering, procurement, construction management, the EPCM model. These are all what we call strategies. So let's see if I can get the word strategies in there. All right, so strategies sit over there, and strategies employ different types of contracts. All right, so in your mind, you should already start getting an idea of how these things fit together. All right, so for instance, you might get an EPC, which is a lump sum, or an EPC, which is a bill of quantities. All right, and the same with a EPCC. With our EPCM variant, we'll talk about this some more, it's not really a functional construction contract. Right? It's more about management. Right? So it's engineering, procurement, and construction management for and on behalf of the client. Right? So in terms of the first two over there, the EPC and the EPCC, the invoices will have the contractor's name on it. But in terms of the EPCM, the procurement is for and on behalf of our client, and therefore the invoice will bear the name of the client. All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Also, a nice one there, a turnkey contract. All right, so this one is for specialist services. In our industry, maybe a lift or escalator might be a good example of that. What we want is somebody that provides us with the specific solution to our challenge. And they come in, they install the equipment, they make sure everything is safe, everything is according to specification, and they make sure that they commission it. All right, so that's the thing, it's a specialized service. All right, we can also get contracts for pure construction work. Basically, that's just labor outsourcing. It might have components of both labor and material, right, and it depends on the situation. The last two over there, the term services contract and the framework contract, they are basically newish. They haven't been along for too many years. They sort of surfaced in 2005. That's the first time that we really saw the use of term services contracts and framework contracts. So a term services contract gives us a bunch of rates. Right, so there's our rates that we've got, and for a specific term, let's say from 2010 until 2012, these rates are valid from our vendor, and as a client we can go and choose and say, yes, we want those services, but no, we don't want those services over there. Right, so those are the items that we have, that we can think of. All right, so let's just wait for my PC to pick up speed again. All right, so there we go. And then, of course, the framework contract, that's the one where we say, all right, there's an overall agreement between the employer and our contractor or supplier for specific activities. All right, so no real pricing involved. It's just a framework contract to say, yes, this is an agreement. We'll do some work together. All right, so any questions so far from anyone? If you have any questions, just put up your hand. You can put up your hand by just clicking on the little hand icon. So you'll see there's a little one that is displayed next to your name, and then I know you've got a question. Alternatively, just click on the talk button, and that will take care of that. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, and this is where we're going to have a look at the different types of contracts. So this is basically just a list of all the contracts that we have available to play with. All right, so for your question in the assessment item, you have to come up with contract types and strategies for those four different types of scenarios. All right, so we'll look in detail at each of these in the next couple of minutes and make sure that you have a good idea of what to do. All right, so let's start with the first one, the lump sum contract. So who of you guys can give us an example of a good environment to use a lump sum contract? Anyone? You can either use the chat button or the talk button. Just put up your hand. All right, so I can see Reese, you typing up the answer there. All right, houses. All right, so yep, typically for a small contract, a lump sum contract might use. What we want to see is that the statement of work or the scope of work is very, very close to being final. All right, so we need a lot of detail in the lump sum contract. And that's specifically from our client's perspective. All right, so the client or the employer needs to make sure that the scope is really well defined because he's going to employ a contractor, and the contractor is going to do the work for him. So the contractor then takes the scope of work that he gets from our client and he works only on that. All right, so for that whole scope of work, he gives us a single price, and that single price becomes the contract price. All right, so what would you say are the main disadvantages of using a lump sum contract? All right, we'll look at that in a slide or so, but in the meantime, what can you guys come up with? What do you think is one of the biggest disadvantages for a lump sum contract? What about things like changes to the contract? All right, so Adrian, you say the client, the risk of the design, variations, yes, all right, so all of those things. Yet definitely this is not a very flexible contract, all right, so this is not flexible, and it means that if our client wants to make changes, it's going to cost him big bucks, all right, so, and obviously, our vendors out in the market, they know it, and so they do price high. All right. And there I've given you a little bit of a hint. The vendor takes all the cost risk, but the buyer takes the risk for the changes, like you guys have correctly identified. Right, so the standard forms that we have in the industry, there's many of them around. I've just given you one or two of them. The Australian standard, there's a typical example there. The new engineering contract, option A, which is a lump sum with activity schedule, and of course FIDIC, which is the European substitute, comes out with the Red Book. All right, so if we have time later on during the course, I'll talk about the international types of contracts that we have in the industry. All right, so there's our lump sum contracts, a few advantages and disadvantages. All right, so the biggest advantage, the cost will be known right from the outset, and that's because our contractor has got a full scope of work which he can price. The downside, and this is basically the biggest downside, is the flexibility in terms of changes. Because our contractor is going to try and work as quick as possible and as good as possible, his incentive is to try and minimize any kind of overruns, because the quicker and the cheaper he can get the work done, the more money he stands to make at the end of the day. Right, so that's one of the two of the things that we have to keep in mind. The disadvantages, it means that when we go out on pricing, some contractors will allow for option A, some contractors might do B, and some contractors might do C. So it's not apples for apples, or it's basically a apples versus pear type scenario, because not everybody allows for exactly the same specifications, even though the scope is well defined. If there's no document control, it becomes a problem over there. All right, so another problem there, the quality might suffer, and that's because of the contractor's incentive to really work fast and effective and see if he can get the job done as quick as possible, because if he saves a month off the timeline, obviously he's going to be able to save on the overhead, so that's really an incentive for him. Right, and of course the vendors might have to do a little bit more work in order for them to become really successful there. All right, so yep, and so GMP and design and construct equals, all right, so the minimum risk over there. So yes, I agree with that, design and construct. In terms of risk, we'll talk about design and construct a little bit later on again. Thanks, Ryan. Of course, if you do have a microphone, you can just click on the talk button and go for it. That's part of the fun of the system. All right, so let's move on to the next type of contract. All right, so bill of quantities, very basic. This one is used quite often in the industry. It requires a really detailed scope, and even more so than for a lump sum. We also require a lot of time in order for us to get the bill of quantities out. So what we need is a good scope, good specifications, and a quantity surveyor to be able to create the bill of quantities before we go out for our request for quotation to the market. All right, so let's, if we think about this one, we need a scope of work, plus we need our quantity surveyor to have a look at it. That will give us a bill of quantities, and after the bill of quantities, now we can go out to the market and see if we can get a price. All right, so Is a bill of quantities a fixed price contract or is it a reimbursable type contract? Who wants to take a guess there? Is it fixed or is it reimbursable? All right, so Ryan, yes, I can see. Yep, go for it. Yeah, Ryan? Okay, I can see you've got your microphone open, but we can't hear anything. So, all right, so you've switched off the microphone again. And if you don't have any chat, you might want to do the configuration for the microphone again. Just click on that little button next to the audio video panel, and that will get you going to make sure that you've got the right settings there. Ryan, you've got an open mic, so do you want to say something? All right, so, yep, okay, so not working, Ryan, your mic's not working, okay, that's fine. All right, and reimbursable, yep, so this one is going to be reimbursable because it's actually a remeasurable type contract. All right, so let's just quickly stop there for 1 second, that's a little clock. Just quickly, did all of you guys go through the little process to set up your microphones and everything? If you can just give me a yes or a no that I can see, like that. All right, so Paul, you did go through it, and Reese, you also. All right, so we've got quite a number of yeses there, and some of you guys don't have microphones, so that's fine. I just wanted to know if the system is working or if it's something on my side. All right, so Ryan, you're working on a different computer. We won't keep it against you at all. All right, so there's another smiley face for you. All right, so where would we typically use these bill of quantity type contracts? It's basically where we say the work is really well defined, all right? So we've got a good scope of work, we've had some time to work on it, but the quantities might be a little bit difficult for us to work out on. And then we can use a bill of quantities type contract to get going and get started. So for large infrastructure projects, dams, highways, those are the types of contracts that would typically work really well for us. All right, so once again, there's some standard forms that we can use. The new engineering contract option B, that's a bill of quantities. The Australian standard, there's a number of general conditions of contract that we have to take into mind when we work with bill of quantities. FIDIC, right, which is the European version, has 2 options there for us, either the red book or the yellow book. You just need to choose the right option. And then, of course, the NDA and HIA have different ones that are specifically designed for the Australian market. All right, so bill of quantities can also, it's also known in the industry as ad measured, so also known as, so if somebody talks about an ad measured contract, basically it's the same thing as a bill of quantities. All right, so ad measured is a slightly older term, so if you work with somebody that's maybe from Europe or from England, they use a contract over there which is called ICE, Institute for Civil Engineers, which typically refer to that as ad measured. All right, so that's where that term comes from. All right, so if we look at the advantages for our bill of quantities, very well defined scope of work, and the payment in terms of the work is only for the work that was actually done. All right, so that's a big plus for our client. The question that I want to leave with you guys is, let's say you are the contractor and you have to buy pipes, and the pipes are only sold in 6-meter lengths, and you are only going to install 2.5 meters. What are you going to get paid for in terms of a bill of quantities contract? Who wants to take a guess with that? All right, so yes, Adrian, that's right. You only get paid for the 2.5 meter length that's installed. All right, so if there's going to be wastage, you have to figure out exactly how you're going to work the value of that wastage into that waste. Yep, and there you see, yep, that's perfect, Ryan. You say that you would consider the waste as well. Yes, So 6 meters minus 2.5, there's a bit of wastage. Can you use it on another project? Maybe not, maybe you can. So those are the options that you have to think about. All right, so if we look at the disadvantages, all right, so one of the major disadvantages is obviously we're only going to know the final price after the job has been completed, and even after that, it might take a while for us to work out the final account. All right, so typically the end of job documentation needs to be in place before we can sign off on that final account. We might have a very zealous quantity surveyor or a student on site that's going to start measuring concrete foundations. I had that happen to me, and typically what they do is, it was just for a normal house foundation. Let's see how well I can. So I had brickwork like that, and this was a concrete floor or a concrete base, and there was the ground level. And what the quantity surveyor did is he actually pegged a steel dropper in there just to make sure that we did actually do the concrete base to the correct level and the correct depth. So you do get those guys that's going to actually try and measure everything on site. Sometimes you get away with it, sometimes you don't. All right, and the buyer or the client carries the risk for the increase in quantities, while our vendor or the contractor, he carries the risk for the costs. All right, so he gives us the price per item, so the vendor or the contractor is going to carry the risk for that cost over there. All right, so how do we deal with changes? How do we deal with changes in terms of this contract? Anybody? Is it easy to do? Is it more difficult than, for instance, a lump sum type contract, or is it easier for us to administrate? Anybody want to take a guess? I can see, Adrian, you typing up an answer there. So because we have our bill of quantities set out over there, so yep, contract summary adjustments, yes, all right, so it is typically easier for us to administrate the changes in a bill of quantities contract. Why? Because we've got the rates. All right, so we've got the rates in our bill of quantities, and if there's any changes in the bill of quantities, we just have to change the quantities, and of course it gives us the total at the end of the day. So for the client, there's a little bit of security in that. The only difficulty will be when there's a new additional item that wasn't part of the original bill of quantities. Right, so that's going to make it a little bit more difficult and colorful for our clients. All right, so another type of contract that's out there in the market is called the target contract, and it's not really that well used in Australia. I haven't encountered it as much. You guys that's in the industry over there might give me a better idea if you guys have come across it. And basically this one is where it's a joint venture between the contractor and the employer. They set up sort of share contribution ranges at the beginning of a contract to say that if the contract comes in at 80% of the quote, the contractor is going to get 15% of the saving. If it comes in 90 to, let's say, 80 to 90% of the contract value, is going to get 10%. If it comes in between 95 to 105, he gets 5%. All right, so how it works is, yep, basically a cost plus reimbursement type contract. The difference with this one is that if there's a saving for, let's say the contractor comes in at 80% of the total value of the contract that he initially priced for. That saving, all right, there's a saving of 20%. The contractor is not going to be able to pocket the full 20% saving. He is only going to be able to pocket 15% of that 20%. All right, so that's how a target contract works. It's basically an incentive, a joint venture between these two parties to make sure that they do keep together. The same with if it goes over. Let's say the contractor comes in at 120%, which means that is spent 20% more than what they anticipated. Based on these contribution scales, we'll do a calculation and the contractor will be, yep, there we go, it's a share, pain and gain. Yep, perfect, Ryan, that's exactly what it is. And there's our little graph, and I'm sure most of you guys have seen this. So basically, if we lose, we're going to see that we have to pay an additional fee from our client. But the contractor is also going to be responsible for a little bit of risk there. And of course, if we save, all right, so there's our underrun, we've saved a little bit of money, it means that our contractor is going to save a little bit and our client is going to be able to get the rest of it over there. All right, so these are the things that makes this contract really interesting. What's the biggest problem that you guys have encountered with a pain or a share, gain and pain type contract? What's the biggest problem that you guys have encountered? Anybody? It's a nice tool for working together and making sure things happen, sharing information and all of those, but it's really heavy on admin. All right, so it really heavy on admin from the contractor side. He has to submit all of these claims, all of the documentation. It's basically an open book accounting system, and our client has to make sure that those costs and all of the expenses that's on the contract is actually valid in terms of the contract. All right, so internationally, it's used quite regularly. So in the Middle East, Africa, for instance, the target contracts are really used extensively. The benefit for our employer is basically he can choose who's going to do the planning for him. All right, so, and there's also that contribution from our vendor in terms of design, the development requirements, who's going to be able to give us the best. You can basically align yourself with the best consultants. Right? So making sure that you choose people that can actually do the job. All right, and then of course the old question again: what happens in terms of changes? All right, so if there's a change, what happens? Will the total value of the contract stay the same? No, of course not. Total value of the contract increases by the same amount of the change. So if there's a compensation event, typically these are called compensation events. If there's a compensation event that's applied to the contract, it will increase the value of the contract. It will not negatively influence our contractor. Right, so there's our disadvantages. So it's really heavy in terms of admin. Really needs to put a lot of effort in there. It becomes a management nightmare. And of course, as with all of the other contracts, the accuracy of our initial scope depends on how accurate our scope was. All right, so these are the items that we have to think about when it comes to target contracts. When we look at the next one, a schedule of rates or activity schedule, this is slightly different to a bill of quantities. It's basically a list of activities that's prepared by our contractor, and the contractor has looked at the scope of work and he said, all right, so I'm going to build, let's see if I can draw a little factory. If there's our factory, that's what the client wants. So based on that drawing over there and the specifications that he's received from his employer, this is the list of activities. All right, so the difference with bill of quantities and activity schedule is, of course, the contractor will only receive payment for 100% completed activities, all right, which makes it a little bit more troublesome for our contractor because it means that he has to plan his cash flow a lot better. All right, so the big difference there is, of course, bill of quantities, we can do sectional completion. All right, so if we have a 75% completion on a bill of quantities, it means that we can get 75% of the cost because it's remeasurable. In terms of our activity schedule, if it's 75% complete, our contractor is going to get 0. All right, so that's a 0 because we only pay on 100% completed activities. All right, so that's a little bit of a downside. It's still used really well in the industry. And of course, you can see there the total of the prices is the price for the work, including profit and risk. All right, so the big thing there is always going to be risk and profit. All right, so the activity schedule already contains our contractor's profit that he's aiming to make there. All right, so I can see that Matthew has just joined us. Welcome, Matthew. We're just talking about the different types of contracts. All right, so the schedule of rates and activity schedule, some advantages. It's a quick start. It's a quick start mechanism over and above our bill of quantities, because we don't need to work out exactly what goes into the bill of quantities. All right, so our contractor comes up with his activity schedule over there, and he says this is what we're going to charge, and the total of the sum of all of the activities, that's the price of the work. So that's the price of the work that he needs to do. The disadvantage, it can be really difficult for the employer to determine what the real price of the work is going to be. All right. He doesn't know how much profit and risk has been allowed for, therefore he might be taken for a ride if he's not well connected with the industry to know what the relevant pricing scheme should be. Difficult to determine the best value offer, as I said. Who knows how much profit and risk is built in there? And like I said in the lecture last night, profit is not a dirty word. All right, so profit not a dirty word. Contractors are in business for specific reasons, and profit needs to be made. All right, so that's just why we're in the market in any case. All right, so it's not used in public sector contracts. Why? Because it's not transparent enough in terms of the requirements of the public sector. All right, it's more used for private sector, large infrastructure contracts. Oil and gas companies, KBR, Halliburton, those guys would typically use the activity schedule types contracts. All right, so another one that we can talk about, cost plus fee. All right, I've given you a little bit of a heads up there. And what it is, a cost plus fee is we've given our contractor a, in certain aspects, a check, a blank check that's been signed. All right, and the vendor, obviously, the more he spends, the more expensive it becomes, the more he's going to make out of the type of contract that we've got. The quality and cost control is always going to be an issue, because how do we know what the contractor is really, where can we draw a line? It's really difficult for us to control that. The same with a cost plus fee type reimbursable contract. Right? So if we think about a professional services contract, which is cost plus fee, how many hours is actually going to be suitable for the work that we're going to do? All right. Who knows what BOICA stands for? It's an acronym. Any takers for that? No idea? All right. So it's basically, it says bend. Yep, there we go. Paul, you've got it. Bend over, here it comes again. So this is typically what we see, sort of generalization in the market, but it typically happens with a cost plus fee type contract. There's standard contracts, NEC option E. All right, so standard contracts that's designed for that. We typically use it when there's limited time available, and it's most prevalent in the use of professional services types contracts. All right, so the fee, it can be a fixed percentage. All right, so let's say 5% of the works, or it could also be a fixed fee. All right, so this one, the fixed fee doesn't happen often. All right, we don't see that one in the market many times, because it means that the contractor is basically locked into that deal. So they don't typically like to do that. All right, so they prefer working for a percentage. Most of us have been in the market. I spent many years in the Middle East doing work like this, and we never wanted to go for a fixed fee. We can also do a fixed fee with a guaranteed top price. We'll talk about that one just now. Also, this one is not really prevalent in the market, so we don't see too many of them. A fixed fee plus a bonus. All right, so this is typically where we say if we finish on time and within the expected budget parameters, there might be a bonus. All right, so one of the biggest hassles that I always had in contracting is the clients want to apply a penalty for late completion or overruns. Why don't they apply an incentive for early completion and if we save some money? So we do see a little bit of that happening in the market now, and there's more incentives coming forward. Not sure if it's still happening in the industry at the moment with the downturn in the economy. It's sort of a negative swing there. All right, so this one is basically what we call, or what we spoke about earlier on, the target contract, fixed fee with an arrangement for sharing any cost saving or over expenditure. All right, so that one goes both ways. All right, where shall we use these? All right, so if the buyer doesn't have a really well-defined scope, so the scope of work is a little bit fuzzy, we want our project to kick off and get going at the same time. All right, so we need our contract to move ahead. There's an emergency type project. We've got limited time. We don't really have lots and lots of time to wait for stuff to happen. Unknown technologies, or there might be major changes, and of course the contractor possesses a special ability. All right, so another option that we might do there is of course a turnkey type contract. All right, so those are the items that we have over there, and let's see if we can move on. All right, I might just pause the recording for a second. All right, so let's continue. For some reason, I've lost the connection on the other side. So cost reimbursable contracts, we've just spoken about that. Let's just go back one slide to where we say the cost plus fee. We've got some advantages over there. The flexibility in design, and of course we're going to draw on our contractor's expertise during the design. The disadvantages that we face, obviously it's going to be really difficult for us to do quality control over there, and of course it might be that our contractor is going to pay less attention to the cost control. Alright, so just to make sure everybody is can still hear me, if you can give me a yes or a no on the screen. All right, great. Let me just see. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. This is basically a summary of our cost reimbursable contracts. We've got a few advantages there. For all cost reimbursable type contracts, this is where we can see, yes, we're going to get some input from our vendors. The buyer has a little bit more flexibility in terms of alterations and additions, and of course the buyer is only going to pay for the real costs. All right, so that's not always 100% true. Our contractors has the ability to add a little bit of profit in risk in there, and we don't really know what the percentage of the profit is going to be. The disadvantages that we face, obviously, what forces our contractor to work better? All right, there's no real incentive for them to work productive and to reduce the cost. The more work they do, the more money they spend, the more they're going to make out of it. And then, of course, the buyer has to apply extensive control measures in order to manage that whole process. All right, so if we go on to the next slide, some other variants that we've got in the market, the guaranteed maximum type price. As I said, we don't see that often, really only when there's a well-defined scope with the minimum chances of there being any kind of changes to the works information, we'll see a guaranteed maximum price. Certainly in my 3 years in Australia, I haven't come across a guaranteed maximum price as of yet. Alright, so let's have a quick look at a purchase order. Alright, so this one is what we're going to use when there's an off-the-shelf item. Let's say, for instance, you have to procure a turbine or something like that from overseas. It might mean that you are going to have to give us just a purchase order, because there's no change in the scope of work. It's an off-the-shelf item. There's no customization that you have to do. Purchase order becomes a commercial document, and of course the moment we've issued it, there's some obligations we have to pay. It creates a commitment from our side. So vendors are quite happy with that, and they will ship based on that. If you ship from overseas, obviously you might have to work in a few other items as well. For instance, payment is always an issue, especially if you work in Africa. European vendors typically don't want to supply stuff to the African continent without having their funds cleared in the bank. So that's just a precaution from their side to make sure that they do get the funds in place. If we look at the strategies now, so we've looked at all the different types of contracts. We said that there's a lump sum contract, there's a bill of quantities type contract. We spoke about the schedule of rates and the activity schedule. We've spoken about the target contract, the pain and gain, and we've touched on the purchase order. So all of those are types of contracts that you can use for basic work to be done. If we now step back one level and we start thinking about the strategies that we're going to employ, this is what's happening in the market. We've got a few strategies that employ contracts. So the strategies will sit on top of our contracts. So you can have an engineer, procure, and construct scenario where you have a lump sum or an activity schedule or even a bill of quantities. All right, so let's look at a typical EPC type environment. All right, so first instance, the scope has to be well defined for us to be a fixed price, and if the scope is poorly defined, we can split it into different parts. All right, so what we'll do is we'll say if it's a poorly defined scope, we'll split it into the first part will be for the design aspect. We'll employ our professional team. The professional team will come up with a design, and of course once we've got the design completed, that will form the basis of the second part of our contract, and we'll negotiate then for a fixed price on the second part of that contract. All right, so that gives us the two different types of contracts that we might use in our EPC environment. Another variant on that is EPCC, which is just the second C is just commissioning. So EPCC includes the startup and commissioning for a big plant. Let's say, for instance, we're building a gas to liquid plant or a beer brewery or anything like that. You might choose to get your contractor to commission the plant as well. All right, so if the vendor is really clued up, he might be employed to do that. If the employer is really clued up and know exactly what their business is about, they might choose or opt not to have that as part of the contract. If we look at the engineer, procure, and construction management, this is typically where we said it's only going to be professional services. All right, so the key that you have to remember here is that it's engineer, procure for and on behalf of our client, and construction management. All right, so in terms of an EPC relationship, our EPC contractor doesn't do any of the contracting work himself. All right, so he's just managing that whole scenario, and he's making sure that the work gets done in terms of the EPC relationship. All right, so the services for EPC might include the engineering and design, all of the procurement, and remember what we said about the procurement there. The procurement will be carrying the name of the employer, all right, because it's for on behalf of the client. And then, of course, the managing of the construction efforts. So this is where our superintendent or supervisor comes into play as well, because together with the project manager, they'll be responsible for the execution of the project plus the managing of the quality. All right, so it can be a number of multiple different types of contracts. If you have a look at last week's recording, we did go through one or two of the scenarios over there. We can also encounter professional services contracts as part of a strategy. All right, so any type of professional service that we might find. So design, quantity surveying, all of those would typically fall into a professional services type contract. Right? It might even be something like risk management, or if you have to do an environmental impact assessment study. All of those will be professional services contract. The key thing that you have to do there is remember the quick check for when it's safe to use a professional services contract. So if you use any tools, you have to ask the question, what type of tool is it that you're going to use? If you're going to use a spade or anything where you have to wear safety gear or maybe a back actor, then a professional services contract can no longer has relevance. All right, so then we need to move on to a execution type contract where you cover the risk on site. Let's say it's a quantity surveyor and he uses a laptop. A laptop, it can also be considered as being a tool. So in this case, we have to move on to the next question, which is changing the environment. All right, so let's look at another example. We think about a geologist. All right, so the geologist is employed to provide us with a report for a new site. Let's do two scenarios. The first scenario is you just have to go onto site, check it out, take a few photos, and then write a simple report. All right, so for that type of work, we're not changing the environment, and we can use a professional services contract. Let's say that same geologist now has to go back to that site, and he has to dig a few test holes. Right? He has to use his back actor, his TLB, he has to come onto site, he has to dig a few holes, and he's going to start changing the environment. All right, so the moment we start using big tools, we change the environment, the professional services contract can no longer be used. All right, so those are the types of questions that you can ask. It's all about tools, the environment, and of course associated risks. All right, so remember, a professional services contract is typically designed only for use in an office environment. Let's call it a soft type of contract where we sell hours. All right, so you might have a design team, they're going to sell hours, and we're going to pay them reimbursable rates for those hours. All right, are there any questions at from any of you guys? As I said, just push the talk button, and I'll be able to respond to that. The turnkey type contract, this one, we spoke about this earlier on. It's basically where we have a single contractor that's offering a really advanced technology. All right, so either a lift or an escalator or a conveyor system, anything like that, or even a tank farm. All right, so if you're building a big plant, let's say a beer brewery, let's use that example again. At the beer brewery, you're going to have a tank farm that's going to maintain or keep all of your feedstock in place. And in that case, you will use a turnkey contractor. All right. Why? Because he's going to come in with the technology, he's going to supply the equipment, he's going to do all of the construction work, and he's going to make sure that your tank farm is commissioned and that it runs smoothly before he hands over the keys. All right. So that's basically where the name comes from. It's an old cliche, turnkey. All right. So turn the key, there you go, and it's the end of that type of contract. All right, if we look at the relationship between the contract types in terms of risk and flexibility, what I wanted to show you here is, we saw this slide for the first time last week, but there you can see I've given you all the different types of contracts. There's our lump sum, the bill of quantities sit over there, target contract, and there's our employer's flexibility. The flexibility over there is absolutely a minimum at the top of that line. The employer's risk, however, is at a minimum. All right, so that means that for a lump sum, he's got little flexibility in terms of changes, but his risk is a minimum in terms of cost. For our contractor, that scenario is turned around. All right, so the contractor's incentive to work really well is at a maximum when it comes to a lump sum contract or an activity schedule type contract. Why? Because he has to perform really well to make sure that he saves time, that he works effectively. The more time he can save, obviously the higher the profit that he's going to get out of it. What we need to watch out for at that level, lump sum contracts and activity schedule type contracts, is of course quality issues. All right. As we move along the line, a bill of quantities, types of contracts, we start sharing the risk. Right, so that's what I'm trying to show you here is basically we're sharing the risk between our employer and our contractor. And as we move down the line to reimbursable type contracts over here, where we have the management type contracts that sits over there, these become really, really difficult because now our employer's risk is at a maximum. The contractor's incentive to work really well, work really productive is now diminished. All right, so from his side, obviously he's going to see, all right, I don't need to work as effectively because I've got minimum risk in the whole process. If we move on from that and look at contracting combinations or new developments, we see in the market quite a number of strategic partnerships happening. So this would typically be where contractors go into business at below cost. So we do a project just to stay in business. We see this happening when there's a downturn in the economy, which is now basically we can see quite a number of those happening at the moment. Right, it might also be a strategic partnership between a government organization and let's say for instance a private company which has a specific type of specialist service. If we're going to build a nuclear power plant, obviously the cost might be prohibitive if it's only one party that's part of it. Right, so we'll talk about those funding options on the next slide. There might also be joint ventures. Right, so sharing the costs or sharing the effectiveness or sharing the resources. Incentive contracts, we spoke about those, pain and gain, and then of course labor-only contracts where it's basically a body shop. Management contracts, those are used for emergencies. There's no real scope. Let's say for instance our hospital has just burned down and we really have to build it as quick as we possibly can. There's no time for us to do a proper scope and a bill of quantities. We might use a management type contract to get our contractor on site as quick as we possibly can. Management type of contracts, they tend to be really expensive, high fees. The fee percentage is really high over there. If we think about the alternative contract funding vehicles, there's a few of these around. Public-private partnerships, and these are just the normal ones. And once again, there's some overlap between them. Build, operate, and transfer. We'll see that public-private partnerships are typically installations like toll roads, prisons. It might be a hospital that's operated by a private company for a number of years. If we think of a toll road, for instance, let's say the deal goes for 20 years. After the 20 years, the infrastructure has to be handed back to the government. The government then takes ownership of that, and the contractor or the private company basically got 20 years worth of benefit out of it in terms of the toll fees. All right, remember that they obviously have to maintain the infrastructure and keep it going. All right, so those are the different types of options. Potential pitfalls with these joint venture type organizations, overarching agreements. We really need to make sure that we've got the roles and responsibilities well planned out. If it's going to fall over, it's because there's going to be gray lines. So if we make sure that we've got all the lines dotted and everything, it makes it a lot easier. Functional overlaps within the parties, more or less the same. Who does what? All right. So if, let's say, for instance, I was involved in a project where we built a housing estate on a golf course, and there was this small little area on the golf course itself where we overlapped with the landscaping contractor. The long and short of it was that that piece of land was never properly developed because we didn't want to do it, and the landscape contractor also didn't want to touch it because there was just no money in it. All right, so make sure that when you do these joint ventures that you do specify well. There might also be situations if we have a EPCM contractor or a contract scenario that we're going to compromise that with an autocratic decision making. All right, so if the voting falls over, we stomp on it and make sure that we get our deal in there. All right, and then of course make sure that you always have that contractual correctness in there. It's not easy to maintain on these large projects. All right, so what I did over here is this is a graph that gives you an idea. This is one that I did for an oil company not too long ago, and this one is for use internally by the oil company. They specifically use 3 different types of contracts. They use the new engineering contract, they use the general conditions of contract, and of course they use the JBCC. You'll also see the reference to FIDIC once or twice, not well used, but I put it in there as an alternative option. Alright, so based on the statement of work over there, basically we're going to decide, is this going to be a goods only, or is it going to be goods and services, or is it going to be services only? Alright, so if you follow the process on this slide, you'll see that if it's goods only, we're going to end up basically with a purchase order. Alright, so it makes it a little bit easier for us to make that decision. As soon as we start doing goods and services, we have to ask a few other questions. Alright, so is it going to be building works? Are we going to start doing civil works as well? Is it a complex type of project that we're going to do? Is it a gas to liquid plant, or is it a golf course? Those types of questions will all influence the decisions that we make. Alright, so when you work through your assessment, this might be a nice slide for you to use. Alright, so if we look at the modern contracting trends, basically the industry is moving slightly away from the bill of quantities, moving towards these joint organizational type joint ventures where we have milestone payments. Alright, so it's all about partnering and collaboration with these big companies trying to get that going. This is typically not in the residential market. This would typically be in the infrastructure, commercial type market, where we see roads, railway stations, harbors, mines, anything like that will fall in there. Management-based contracts, and the reason why the market is moving towards management-based contracts is the time factor. All right, so it is a bit quicker off the mark than waiting for the full design and the bill of quantities to be in place. And typically, if you think about a large plant, let's say you're going to build that brewery again, what's more expensive, the downtime, waiting for your plant to become operational, or the extra few dollars that you're going to pay up front to get going and make sure that you save 3 or 4 months on the delivery date? Alright, so those are the types of trends in the market that we see at the moment, and obviously these change every year as the market develops. Alright, so there we go. Do you guys have any questions for tonight? Just hit the talk button or just use the chat function, and I'll pick it up from there. Alright, I can see Reese, you typing up a message there. Alright, so alright, yeah, go for it. What's the question about the assessment? I might, in the meantime, stop sharing, and let's see if I can get the assessment up and going. This would be assessment number 1, I guess. Alright, so your question is, I can still not find the data for the government services. Is it available within the ABS, or we can find it elsewhere? Alright, so the quick answer there is yes, it is available on the ABS website, but you can find it at a different spot as well. If you go through the questions and answers forum, somebody posted a link there yesterday. I can't remember exactly who it was. I'll go and look for it tonight. I'll make sure that it's highlighted. Alright, so if you've seen that, alright, so I'll go and check the link, Mark, and I'll just make sure. I'm not sure why the link isn't working. I had a look at it. I actually downloaded the document. It's about 160 pages, if I remember correctly, and there's really a lot of helpful information in there. I know the ABS website isn't the best site around. It's really it's almost like working on the BCA website, and it's just not user-friendly at all. So yes, any other questions?
Hey, George, can you hear me?
Yes, Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, you can hear me. Good, got it to work. Hey, I just wanted to touch base. You mentioned you haven't seen too many gross maximum or guaranteed maximum price contracts being used. What do you see as the main differences between a GMP and a lump sum contract?
Well, it's okay. So just make sure that I understand correctly. Your question is, what do I think is the difference between a lump sum contract and a guaranteed maximum price type contract?
Yeah, that's right. I traditionally see them piggyback on top of each other. So whenever I've been engaged in a lump sum contract, it's also been a guaranteed maximum price also.
Yeah, there's not a lot of difference between those two, right? It's much of a muchness for me. If you the guaranteed maximum price, as I said earlier, I haven't seen that in my 3 years in Australia. You know, from a contractor's point of view, lump sum, you know exactly what you're going to get. There's a scope of work. Everything is perfectly worked out. If there are any changes that wasn't part of the original scope, it means that you know, you get reimbursed for that. However, the same applies to omissions. Let's say, for instance, you forgot to add $15,000 to it. You're going to have to wear that because it's part of a lump sum contract, and the same applies for a guaranteed maximum price. So yeah, I'll think about you know, a good answer there. I don't really have a good answer offhand for that.
What I'm saying, which is probably a little bit more complex than just having them traditionally listed out, is that all my contracts are fairly heavily integrated. So there'll be lump sum guaranteed maximum price with a part schedule rates on some fixed items. There'll be some minor bill of quantities thrown in there. It'll be a complete design you construct based on a preliminary design. There'll be a client brief. The contract itself will be the smallest part of the documents. The rest of them will are special conditions, you know, which really turn this sort of stuff up on its head. There's nothing really traditional about it, but it's just a whole mix-mash of integrated procurement strategies now.
Yeah, it becomes, you know, it becomes more and more complex. You know, if we can turn back the clock 20 years, we'll be in a lot better shape. You know, because the contracts, it's like going out to a bar, you know, and picking up somebody of ill repute. Let's say early on during the evening, you still have high standards, you know, and as you consume more and more beers, your standards lower, and you get to take somebody home. How do you protect yourself? And this is what employers and contractors do. They write contracts. Instead of using latex products, they do contracts, you know. So
yeah,
that's, you know, and it is becoming more and more complex. So yeah. So Adrian, you've also given us a little answer there. You say that a guaranteed maximum price on a smaller project around 3 million, that's the one that you've worked on, and it's less common as the builders inflate the price to cover unforeseen errors. So that's standard. I think that's everybody, you know. I've also made a few mistakes in my life where I've costed my employers a few thousand you know, South African rands and US dollars. Because my Excel formulas didn't pick up on all of it in the final tab, you know, and we had to wear that. That's just one of those things. Yeah, BHP Billiton, they would typically have money. Any of the mining companies are really in good shape. All right, so Ryan, I'll have a look. I've made a note to try and get a better structured answer for you on the differences between a GMP and a design and construct or lump sum, and see if I can get that, and I'll post it up onto the questions and answers database for you, okay? All right, so Mark, all right, so A1 related question, what is the size expectations regarding question 4? Like always, quality, not quantity. Yes, remember I have to read all of your notes, so make sure that you write the right stuff. I'm not too worried about if it's too short. Just make sure that you cover, and it's a functional answer that you submit. Mark. So as long as you cover all the questions and you've given me what I need, don't waffle on just for the sake of waffling. That's, it's just not productive. So if you can say, okay, well, I'm still struggling with this slightly with the weighting and the score. All right, so what you have to do there is basically come up with what's more important. Is it the commercial aspects that's more important, or is it the technical aspects that's more important? I actually found a really nice website today, and I'll post that together with the answer for Ryan tomorrow. That will give you an example of a similar type of scenario where you have to, in fact, I can't remember if I've already done that. I think I might have already done that onto the questions and answer database. So just go in there, check all the posts that I made today. I think I did it today. But that link will give you a good indication of how to deal with the weighting and the score that you're going to attribute to it. No, the weighting and the score is not going to be the same. All right, so it's not one element, it's two different elements. So you're going to, let's say you've got technical aspects. Let's say scope is going to represent 30%. All right, but out of the 30%, your contractor is going to score, let's say, 15 out of 30. All right, so therefore 15 out of 30, that gets carried on to the next column, and that goes to your total. All right, so that is definitely going to be two different elements, and it's not going to be one. You're going to have the weighting, all right, commercial, technical, and then of course, you can count the weighting out of anything, all right, but you're always going to bring it back to 100%. All right. All right, so the question is, need to have a contractor to assess to get a score. Well, in this case, I made the question a little bit more difficult for you guys, because in this case, I just gave you a specific project. All right, so you have to now, in terms of the project, come up with a hypothetical value for that specific project. It's not going to be a contractor-based type question that you're going to have there. All right, so I see Reese is left. He's left before I could give him the answer. So yep, hopefully he'll be able to watch the recording. All right, do you guys have any other questions or anything else that I can help you with the assessment? All right, there Reese is back again.
Yeah, hey Josh. Just one thing on question 4 is I probably was overlooking into it, but you think the weighting could be rated in all different ways compared to what context you're looking at. Like if you were preparing the report for the client side or a contractor side, or how they were procured, you'd have a lot of different results. A contractor is going to look at the pre-qualification criteria a lot differently than the vendor, for example. Is there any specific person that this report is supposed to be going out to, or can we make that up ourselves?
You can make that up yourself. You've got carte blanche on that. I don't want to limit, because in the class we've got people from both sides of the fence. We're going to have a few contractors, we're going to have a few government officials, and of course we're going to have a few independent private companies being the client. So I want to leave that as open. And what you do is, in the first paragraph of the question, you might say, all right, these are the assumptions that I've made, and this is how I'm going to approach that question. I don't want 20 of the same questions. I want a little bit of variation from you guys. So take an individual approach, like you said. If you're a contractor, use the contractor's approach and complete the question based on that.
Okay, good, thanks.
All right. All right, so there we go. Paul, you've got a question. I can see you typing that out. We'll just wait for that to come through. All right, so government services contribution. All right, so what's the what do we have to do there? All right, so that one is a little bit of a tricky question. and that's, are we supposed to look at the gross value added? No, you're correct if you say the gross value. That's exactly, you're going to look at the GDP, the value that's being added from the government services. All right. So the first way to look at that question would be to define what government services are. All right. So in your first paragraph, take that away and make sure that you define the different government services. After you've done that, now you can start taking it apart, dissecting it small piece by piece, and saying for this service or this department, this is the GDP, or this is the contribution that's been made to the GDP for that specific service. All right. So does that give you a better answer or better idea of how to approach that question, Paul?
Yeah, it does. Are we just using some of the other sort of categories that they've already got data for? Because like someone said in the forums, you can use, there's certain things that the government will pay for construction or other things. So are we just using the whole total, or are we supposed to figure out some sort of percentage that it's going to be
Paul, Paul, that's a good question. If you use the total, once again, the assumptions that you make at the beginning of your question, each of you guys are going to give it a different approach. So if you're going to use the totals for all of the government services instead of breaking it down, that's fine. Just make sure that when you do that, you do write into the your list of assumptions, make sure that I know exactly how you've done it so that I can actually go and assess it. Like I say, just make sure that you've given me all the information that I need in order to assess your answer. All right, great. So let's move on to Ryan's question. He says, what is an international technology provider? Right, so Ryan, that would typically be somebody that's, let's say, Honeywell, or a company in Germany. Let's say somebody that manufactures gas-powered turbines, Boeing or Rolls-Royce or any of those. That would qualify as an international technology provider. All right, so it's something that's not local. The reason I put that in there is so that you guys can think about how are you going to get it in Australia, how are you going to pay for that, and see, are there different options and different ways of solving that question. All right, great. So thanks for that, Ryan. All right, so what other questions have you guys got that we can think about, that we can answer? All right, so Reese, you've got a question about question number 2. All right, so question number 2 deals with the procurement. All right, so what's the question that you've got over there? All right, so you've said, all right, never mind, you've got it. If you look at last week's presentation, all right, so I've added on the website, I've added the PDFs that you can go and download. I think it's slide number 25 and 26. You'll see there that I've given you 2 different procurement models. All right, so what you can do is you can use that as a base, or you can use your own from the company that you work for, and you can base the question on that model. All right, so what you first have to do, the first part of the question is you have to define your model, and in the second part is you have to apply a hypothetical scenario. So let's say, for instance, somebody asked the same question today in the question and answer database. What you want to do there is, let's say you've got 3 contractors. You have to choose one of those. You choose one of them and you proceed with the negotiation process. You're almost ready to sign the contract, and then the contractor falls over. What steps do you have to take in order to solve or save that situation? All right, so go back into your process and say, all right, in this case, we go back to step number 20. And from step number 20, we select the second best contractor, and we start the negotiation process again. All right, so that's what you're going to do with question number 2. All right, so I hope that answered that question for you, Reese. Any other questions? All right, I can see 2 people typing up questions. All right, great. So that's solved that for you. All right, and Mark, I can see you typing up a question as well. So I'll wait for that one to come through. Yes, yes. Some good news that I want to share with you guys. I think I mentioned somewhere in the course profile that we're going to do a quiz as well. I think we're doing more than enough work so that we don't need to do a quiz. We've got more than enough assignments going. So as soon as assignment 1 is finished, I think assignment 1 is one of the bigger ones, I'll be happy as well. Remember, I have to mark these. So yes, I think the quiz is going to fall away. You guys might enjoy hearing that. All right, great. All right, what other questions, or shall we call it a night before we close? I want to ask you guys something. There's a tea room that's available on the site for you guys to use. I'm not sure if any of you guys have used it before. It's open basically all the time. And I'm also thinking about, there's the Built Environment at CQU website where I post all the adverts for employment and so on. All of you guys get those notifications. Would it be advantageous for you guys if I was available every morning, say between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock online? If you have any questions, that you can come into a session like this and chat with me. Do you guys think that's a good idea, or am I flogging a dead horse there? All right, so Matthew, you say yes, it might be a good idea. All right, so there's a yes there. I'll just put a yes next to my name as well, just to make sure that I'm really positive about it. But those are the ideas that I think you guys as distance students get a bit of a raw deal from the university. You don't necessarily get the support that you need, and it makes it really difficult. So we need to think about ways to get you more involved and get the collaboration going. So yeah, if you have ideas, just respond to those posts, and I'll pick it up from there. All right, so if there are no more questions, yes, one thing quickly from Mark. Is there something like a small project? All right, we'll wait for that one.
Yeah, Josh. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. I just wanted to ask quickly, I saw another student requesting information regarding question 4 in the layout. Is it okay to have one report titled to the CEO, I guess, and contain both projects within the report, and just do a comparison at the end, I guess, dividing it up that way?
Yes, that's fine. That's fine. If you can address, remember what the question asks you. Question number 4 says that you have to identify the 10 most relevant selection criteria. Yeah. So if you can work those differences into your single report, that's perfect. That's fine. I mean, I'm not going to penalize you at all. You guys, you have to think for yourself, and that's what we appreciate.
Yeah.
You think about it.
Yeah, I've separated them so it's clear and. Yeah, that's excellent. And as long as I've separated clearly, so yeah, it should be good then.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks, Mark. That's a good question.
Thank you.
All right, cool. Shall we call it a night? We've been going for a while. If you guys have more questions, I'll be available, tomorrow, Friday or so. I think this assignment is due somewhere next week. As I say, if you have any questions, is it Friday this week? All right, so what I'll do is I'll make sure that I'm available, for you guys. If you have any questions, you've got my mobile number. Just give me a call if you get stuck. Yeah.
Is it scheduled on a Friday, Ryan? Is it scheduled on a Friday? Let me just quickly have a look. I can't remember exactly what I did there. I think it's scheduled for the 23rd, which is 23rd is it Friday? Alright, so I won't penalize anybody if they submit it by Sunday night. Alright, the only reason why I chose Friday is because the university system only allows Fridays or only allows weekdays to be selected. Alright, so if you guys submit on Sunday, no problem at all. Alright. Alright, so I'll just make sure that I post a little note out onto the website for that as well tomorrow. Okay, cool. Alright, yeah, go for it. Have a beer, Mark. Yeah, there's no need to rush as long as you get the answers in by Sunday, so yeah, go for it. Alright, I might just stop the recording now.